Greetings and welcome to another edition of The Pedal Shift Project. The Pedal Shift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments on bicycle travel adventures. From tips and tricks to ideas on how to ride your ride. Let's shrink the world by bike. Show notes and more are available at pedalshift.net/358, and you can email the show at pedalshift@pedalshift.net or text me at 202-930-1109 and check Pedal Shift out on all the socials as well. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 358th edition of the Pedal Shift Project. My name's Tim Mooney. Thanks so much for joining. On this edition, we're going to be doing an e-bike build update or an e-bike procurement update where we left off. You may recall before we did the bike tour, before we did the tour journal, I was talking about what I am considering for an e-bike, the concept of whether I'm going to want to build one or I'm going to buy one. I suppose I'd be buying one in both instances, but purchasing a pre-made one or a commercially available one versus building one of my own. And I've been doing quite a bit of research in the off episode time, including a lot of adventuring, as it were, in the city of Sunshine and Bunnies, Portland, Oregon. And that was really helpful because there were quite a few shops that are catering specifically to e-bikes in Portland. Some of them specifically, they're designed around them, and others that do custom builds. And I thought that was both really, really helpful. I got some great help from a lot of the folks at those shops. So the first thing I'm going to mention for all of this, if you're considering anything around an e-bike, but really this applies to anything having to do with bicycle travel, period, your local bike shop is a really great resource. Now, Portland is not technically my local bike shop, but it was for purposes of my trip there. I want to give a particular shout out to Nomad Cycles, and you can check them out at nomadcyclespdx.com for the bike build option. They are widely considered within Portland to be the experts in terms of custom bike builds. So I'm going to get to those in a moment, because I think, preview, spoiler, I think that's the direction I'm going, is to go with a custom build. Ultimately, after visiting a bunch of different places with a bunch of different makers and a bunch of different manufacturers and a bunch of different brands, and oh man, there are a ton of them. I mean, there is a ton of them, from brands you know to brands you've never heard of. Ultimately, the one takeaway that I have from commercially available bikes is that there are not always, but a lot of proprietary elements to commercial bikes, particularly around the batteries. And I think that that's something that I don't love. And I think that the biggest element to all of that is you're sort of locked into the battery, the way it fits and works within that particular bike system. And that means expandability and availability and everything around the battery and its interface with those commercially available bikes. Again, not all of them, but many / most of them, is that you're limited to the size of that particular battery. And as we've talked about on the last episode, I'm really attracted to the Biking Brian style of massive battery for all of the reasons around that. But also, Brian's bike and other bikes like that tend to be more in custom builds use more universal battery adapters and battery connections. And that's the thing that I think I'm most into, as we'll talk about a little bit later. Also, the other thing that I'd say about most of the commercially available bikes is they are, as I sometimes refer to my beautiful dog Mookie, chonky. I mean, just big and kind of on the heavier side. Maybe that's sort of where I'm at too. I think that there's a reason for all of that, but it's the frame I can't get around. It just looks like a bike share bike. So many of them. Now, I know not all of them are like that, but many of them are, and it looks like an e-bike. And there's something attractive about a bike that is an e-bike but doesn't look like one just from first glance. And I know that that's kind of an aesthetics thing, but I also think that it's part of the functionality deriving from the form too. So I'm stuck on that. And I understand that that's kind of a choice. And I also understand that many of you are totally perfectly fine with a good chonky bike like that. There's good reasons for it. I just can't get by it for some reason. So that gets me thinking, all right, well, what is it? If there are things about a commercially available bike, by the way, which is just the easy button, just that would be the easiest thing. I just look for a bike in my budget range and I buy it and I've got it. And I don't have to think about anything else. I'm riding it the next day. Why? What are the things that are attracting me at this point in time to a custom built? Well, it's got to do with the expandability and the customizable elements to a built bike. And that goes hand in hand with the whole element of not having proprietary elements to it. The fact that I would have a battery that would use non-proprietary connectors means that if I decide to get a second battery or a larger battery or be able to change out the screen that I have that shows the voltage and the battery information on my cockpit area, that I can do that very, very easily. I like the fact that with a custom build, I can conceivably, if I design it this way, convert the bike back to an acoustic bike or make those upgradable elements, well, upgraded, particularly looking at the battery, the motor, and as I mentioned, the screen. Even the little dumb things like the throttle and stuff like that. There's always improvements that are happening in the e-bike world. And if you're using a non-proprietary system, you've got the ability to kind of, well, make those choices and make those changes. Now, are all of these things necessarily going to be compatible and work within the bike that I build? No. And that's the downside to all of this. There is something nice about knowing, oh, there's a new throttle coming out on this commercially available bike and I know it would work. So, this does increase the difficulty level, even as it increases the options that are available to me. A couple of the biggest surprises that I've run into so far, and I think I might have mentioned at least one of these before, but it's definitely been reinforced throughout all this research and all of these visits. Number one, suspension. I really didn't think that suspension was going to be something that I wanted. Now I'm learning and understanding that it's definitely something that you want, at least in some capacity, because when you're going at speed, and it all makes perfect sense to me now, it's just I didn't realize it. When you're going faster, you're going to feel bumps more, and the bumps are going to translate into your handlebars and your seat much more. And that makes sense. Think about when you're going down and you're bombing down a big hill on a standard touring bike or a standard road bike. You definitely feel things a lot more. And in fact, there's also more difficulty with how you kind of stay upright. And that gets to the other piece, which is the width of the tires. So many e-bikes that you've probably seen around town or, well, online, any place, you see these enormously huge, wide tires, almost fat bike tires or more like moped tires on some of them. Now, I'm not interested in stuff that wide, but I have slowly learned here that in order to stay upright, you really need a wider tire the faster that you're going. Now, I'm not talking about going substantially faster, even at my fastest pace, than I could conceivably ride, particularly downhill. But a wider tire is also going to be helpful for giving you some kind of a suspension-like option. We always talk about kind of riding. I think if you go to Russ and Pathel's pedal, he calls it the supple life, which is kind of fun. The softer tires, they kind of help take some of the road bumps out. I think that's kind of what he's talking about, at least. In any event, that's a piece of what's going on with wider tires on an e-bike. So I am now fully in on a wide tire. How wide, I don't know at this point, and some form of suspension, even if it's really simple stuff. I think I'm not interested in fork suspensions and things like that, although you definitely see them on some of the commercially available bikes. But that is definitely something that I'm looking at. And it could be, like I said, could be something very simple, but that's for a later date. So as you can kind of tell, I'm leaning more towards a build. I haven't completely discounted the prospect of a commercially available bike. Also, if anybody is interested in sponsoring me, I will gladly consider your bike if you are in charge of such things. Just hit me up, pedalshift@pedalshift.net. But I am also considering, well, what else is on the table? And of course, doing the build with a currently existing bike certainly reduces the costs. And I'm doing this literally right next to my Safari. By the way, all those months where I said I still haven't fixed my bike, I finally fixed my bike. It's in great shape right now. There were issues. I think the brakes had gotten knocked and I was just too lazy to fix them. And so I was just riding the Brompton for all these months through the winter. So anyways, the Safari is back, baby. The Safari is back. So if I modded this bike, which for those of you who are new to the show, this is my classic touring bike. It's, is it 10 years old? It's roughly 10 years old. I believe I bought it the fall. Yeah, it's actually over 10 years old. And of course, it's all of the components have been changed through the years because obviously there are miles on it. And so the question ends up being, what if I ended up converting this bike into an e-bike? Obviously, as I mentioned, it is clearly the cheapest option that I have available for kind of an out-of-pocket build. An out-of-pocket anything, quite frankly. It's probably less than half of what it would cost to do a full bike build, and probably the same for any purchased commercial bike that I would consider. So pocketbook wise, this is definitely the right direction to go. So that's why I'm considering it. The interesting thing about this is, obviously there are options available, and we'll talk about, actually, this is a good time to talk about the bike build option vis-a-vis the shop in Portland I went to that I've already mentioned, Nomad Cycles. The guy that I talked to, by the way, his name is Tim, which is amazing. When we got introduced, when I walked in the shop, it's like, oh yeah, go over and talk to Tim. And I'm like, is your Tim? And I said I was Tim. And then we had a moment over that. Anyways, Tim, my guy, spent a lot of time with me on all of this stuff. And I think that he got me excited about the prospect of a build because the world is my oyster in the build context. It's like there's nothing that can't be done. Some of the stuff would be more expensive, but we talked about all sorts of different things that went up to like belt drives and internal hubs. It was kind of one of those things where I said, if I was going to do this, I was going to do it, and talked about budgets and stuff like that. And so he was really, really helpful with all of that. And so I want to give Tim a shout out on all of that. So that is a direction I'm still very much considering, even though I'm about to talk about doing it myself. So back to the Safari, the thing that I learned about things with Tim is that there's a lot that has to go into it, especially if I'm not paying him to do it, essentially. So if I'm to do it, there are some barriers involved here, which is a great reason. All of these are reasons to consider having someone else do it because they would do it better. I mean, there's just no question that they would do it better. The barriers involved for me doing it, especially if we're talking about a conversion of my existing bike, is I would have to get some new tools. There's a whole host of different things that would be involved here that I just simply don't have the tools for because I always get those types of things done by a bike shop. Yeah. From as simple as the bottom bracket, I would need bottom bracket tools, or a bottom bracket tool, I think it would be, to remove the current bottom bracket to put in the motor. I mean, it's not expensive, but obviously it was something that I would have to get. I would have to be, as I'll be talking about in a little bit, new cabling tools, cutters and whatnot. There's just a whole bunch of things. Are these very expensive? No, but they're things that I haven't gotten because I don't do those types of things myself. So new tools is a barrier to entry here. New to me procedures kind of goes hand in hand. I've never done some of the things that I would have to do. I've seen a couple of videos on YouTube, which is the way that I roll, and probably many of you do. And that has been really helpful to demystify it. I mean, when you look at someone remove cables or put in cables or whatever, and you've never done it before because, it's scary, you start to realize it's not that big of a deal. You just need to have the knowledge and the right tools, and you can do it much better. So I think that is, although a barrier, I think that that's something that I could overcome, like so many things in life. I'll just go to YouTube. Now we get into specifics. I would have to completely recable this bike, from the shifting cables to the brake cables, for a couple of reasons. Number one, I would be removing one of the whole shifting apparatuses, I don't know how that translates to you, but I would be getting rid of basically my triple. I'd be going to a 1x setup because the mid-drive motor is a single hub sprocket. You can tell this is a good reason why I shouldn't be doing this because I don't know the actual names for things. There's only one gear circle thing there. And I have 3 on my Safari. One thing that I've learned over the years is, although when I got this, so what would I say, 10 years ago or so, triples were the thing that you got in touring. Why? Because it gives you tons and tons of gear range options. And what I learned through the years, I think, was, just because you have lots of different gearing options doesn't mean you use all of them. And I've found that particularly the high gears, I don't use very often, except maybe when I go down big hills. And that only happens a handful of times. So I think that over the years, I've sort of thought, I don't really necessarily need the triple, but I wouldn't mind having the range. I just don't necessarily need all of the small iterations between them, except when I do. And then, you just know that if I ever got rid of it, I would sit there and go, oh, I wish I had that gear. But in any event, an e-bike doesn't have a front shifting option. You are in one gear range, or it's a 1x for those of you who know. And any of the shifting that happens in your back wheel, in that rear cassette. So that's something to be thinking about there. I would have to do a complete recabling because by getting rid of the front one, I would only have one shifting option. So that's one thing that is there. So I'd be at least removing one set. The other thing is I would be looking for a more upright style of riding, which I talked about, I think, a bunch of different ways over a bunch of different episodes over the last couple of years, it feels like. I think that I would be raising up this handlebar set and I would be replacing my beloved mustache bars with a Jones loop of some type or something equivalent to that. And I just don't have the cabling length to be able to pull that off. Plus, frankly, it's probably time to replace those cables anyways. So there's a whole bunch of different things that would be around that. I've never done cables. I've adjusted cables, but I've never done any cutting or anything having to do with cables. That's the whole thing with all of that. This is kind of shifting more into the downsides of things overall of this rather than a barrier to entry, but I'd be losing my acoustic touring bike for this conversion. And there's something about that doesn't quite feel right. This bike has been a really, really big companion for me for a decade, right? And so the conversion, the loss of it, it's like sort of making it the $6 million man. You can rebuild them faster, stronger. If you're old like me, you understand what that means. So yeah, there's something about kind of adding a little motor to this type of a thing that doesn't quite sit right with me, even though it does make some sense. But the loss of it I would feel it. Now, the other side of that coin is just because I'm slapping a motor in there doesn't mean that I'm losing the ability to ride it without an e-assist. I could just turn it off. And by most descriptions of these motors, they ride just fine if you don't have the e-assist going on. So it's not like I lose it, but I definitely am losing that gear range because then it's a 1x. And most of the gearing options, I'm still struggling by what size I would get, because I think that they tend to range from what's roughly my middle chainring size and higher. So in other words, they're higher geared bikes. So if I was riding this bike without any assist, they would be on, higher gearing ranges. So it would be nearly impossible for me to end up riding it up hills unassisted, with it being fully loaded. So that's the thing that I kind of am feeling down about, and it's kind of a downside. A few more downsides I want to throw at you. I'm just throwing all the downsides out here for all of this first. Rim brakes, dumb. This is dumb. I like my rim brakes. I have rim brakes on every bike I own, which is why I was kind of interested in going to disc brakes for my e-bike. I also am not sure if rim brakes are a great idea for an e-bike. So that's something to consider. Now, I could end up just doing an entire new build, and I believe that this bike is rim brake compatible. In fact, I know it is. Excuse me, disc brake compatible. I know it is. That would be another thing, and that would be another thing that I would have to learn and put in and rebuild. So that's something else, and that gets back to cabling. I'd have to recable those brake lines as well. Last on the downside would be the time it would take for me to build this out would, if I do it in bike touring season, which for me is most of the year anyways, but particularly if we're looking spring, summer, fall, it would be during prime touring season. And if I'm taking out my main bike during that process, the only thing I would have left is the Brompton, which is fine, but the Brompton is not the right choice for a lot of the types of tours that I do in the spring, summer, and fall. So it would be definitely a consideration and a downside as well. All right, so that was a really lengthy discussion on barriers and downsides to a build around the Safari. Here's the upsides. It would be a fun project, let's be honest. I think that I've been so afraid of so many of these different things. I think it would be kind of fun. Sometimes I like to get into big builds and big projects like that. I mean, you joined me on the ride, as it were, for the micro camper thing with the Lacrosse. That was a fun build. The other thing that I would say about all of that is that it means that I would know all of the components that go into particularly the thing that makes it an e-bike. By building it from the battery to the cables to all of the different parts, even the screen and the throttle and whatnot, I would know every component that goes into it. So I know where all the connections are. I'm the one who does the connections. That's all really important. The only thing that I wouldn't know, because I think I've definitely disposed of this theory or this idea, is I'm not going to build the battery. I think that Brian was a trooper for doing it, and I think that he's got the confidence to be able to pull something like that off. I really don't, and I found that there are some batteries out there that are good, high quality that I could do to build. There's an argument to be made to do that, because then you would know every component that would go into your battery, but I think I'm going to be purchasing one of those. Another of the upsides is this would really expand my bike mechanic skills. I find myself to be handy for really minimal things. I can adjust brakes really well. I can, to a certain extent, handle any shifting issues, just dumb things like that. I'm also really good with duct tape and with, zip ties. I'm very good at repairing things that way. But this would give me another level up. And I think by purchasing all the tools that I talked about before, I would probably end up doing things like replacing brake cables more frequently. Maybe I'd feel more confident to redo all of my shifting cables. I think that what it would do is it would reduce my costs going forward for all of the things that I typically bring my bike in for a tune-up for. Now, that doesn't mean that I won't bring it into my local bike shop for things periodically. I just think that it would be for bigger ticket types of stuff, maybe replacing drivetrains. But who knows? Maybe I would start to get confident enough that I would start doing all of this myself, which I think would actually be, in the long term, a really good thing and would be a huge money saver. So it's an investment in my bike mechanic skills, which would pay off in the long term. The other thing, and this is kind of dumb, this goes into the whole thing about, I don't like chonky frames. I might be able to repaint this bike frame. It's not that I dislike the look of it. It's kind of distinctive, that's for sure. But I also like the idea of being able to make it even more incognito. As an e-bike, it's a bit of a target. I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, but there is something to be said about being able to strip everything down and just doing a simple paint job on it. I think that would be kind of cool. I could get it properly done. That would obviously be more expensive, or I could just do it punk rock style and just use some, spray paint or layers of spray paint on it, which is probably the way that I would go. So anyways, yeah, there's elements to all that. Would my bike be orange then? Maybe. Maybe we would consider that for sure. So those are all of the upsides there. I think that it's just really attractive to me, but I also know how hard and how much harder it would be. Just to go all the way back to the beginning here, the easy button is the easy button for a reason, right? All I have to do is go and slap a credit card down and I walk out with an e-bike. And then all of the downsides that I talked about disappear. So, You can tell I'm still struggling with all of this, but I'm glad that I'm kind of talking this all out with you, because I think that it just gives you a sense of what I've been spending hours and hours on, both awake and asleep probably. This is all happening in my subconscious as well, I think. I wanted to make sure that everybody is reminded that Biking Brian put out his build video, and if you haven't checked it out, definitely go check it out. It's his most recent, when this goes out, unless he puts out a new one, it will be his most recent video when this podcast drops. It was really helpful for understanding how he went about it, and particularly the load management. And when I'm not talking from a battery perspective, I'm talking from a weight perspective with the battery. That battery that he's got is absolutely enormous, and enormous in weight. And so I think that I learned a lot by where it went. I, for whatever reason, thought it was on his rear rack, but it's actually up on his front pannier. And I think that that's really interesting. I've never, and this surprises a lot of people, I've never used front panniers ever in any bike that I've ever had. I've always had the weight a little bit further up, and I know that that's less ideal. Having your weight on your front be low is a much better situation, and that's why he does it. Now, the downside is that Brian's constantly riding that bike with front panniers. Sometimes that's all he rides with. And, that works. That works for him. I'd have to get used to that kind of a thing. It does make sense. That said, I don't know. Am I just being weird about all of this? I don't love front panniers. I don't love the look. I don't love the vibe. I don't know why. It's just a thing. So it's a choice. Is it the right choice? Probably not. But I'm thinking about looking at a different option for carrying the battery, even after I think that he made a great and probably superior argument for putting it on the front. And that would be to reconsider positioning it. He mentions that he could not fit his battery in all of the places that I'm looking at. So the consequence of me making this decision may mean that I go a different route than Brian's ginormous battery. It may mean that I end up deciding to go for the not able to fast charge as fast, smaller pair of batteries that I would be using. Some things that I'm considering: putting it in the triangle, which is where most e-bike batteries end up living. There's some really interesting builds that I've seen, and I've seen a lot of them in my research, where they will have a triangle bag and they'll have a battery or batteries in the triangle bag. I think that's a really interesting idea, because the triangle that I've got is pretty big. There'd be consequences to that. I would lose my water bottle cages almost assuredly. So that's one spot. The other, of course, is to put it on the rear. And I have come up with all sorts of different things. And Sam, my virtual assistant, has been really helpful in talking through the concept of battery builds that would be on the rear, including potentially splitting the two batteries into two sides so they kind of hang like panniers on the rear. Kind of an interesting idea. Maybe considering something along those lines. There's probably other things that I would be considering as well. One thing that I'll mention, and Brian doesn't speak to this, and it's probably because he may have secure spots for his bike when he goes places. I read all the time, particularly on Reddit, about people who are getting their batteries stolen, their bikes stolen. E-bikes are a target for all sorts of good reasons. These batteries are often $500, $600, $700 or more. It's pretty wild. And that's obviously a target. Many e-bikes, their batteries literally lock to the frames for that reason. There are all sorts of different locks that are built for e-bike batteries. That would be something that I would have to consider. But if I'm putting it in a triangle bag, I mean, you can't lock it that way. So that's a consideration. Bike theft is definitely a consideration, which is also why I'm thinking of the idea of my bike not looking like an e-bike. A chonky e-bike is good from a bike theft prevention strategy. Repainting my frame, looking at maybe, I'd said orange, but frankly, actually, I'm considering all black, Aaron Flores style. I do think that reducing the look of this thing from being as cool of a bike as it will be would be a consideration with all of that. Okay, this has been a somewhat chaotic, even though I have an outline here, I feel like this has been a chaotic discussion. I hope you've been able to follow all of this. Let's get to next steps. I have a spring tour that is coming. I mentioned that on the last episode, and it needs to happen on the Safari. There is no other option. So I might have considered trying to convert this bike ahead of this. In fact, I did. I really was very serious. I just went through a week where it would have been a possibility. I'm glad I didn't, because it turned out work, my day job stuff ended up being really, well, it was a lot during this week. It was actually this week as I'm sitting here, and it would not have been possible, and it would have been bad if I had started the project now. I might have considered it for this week, and especially since this week didn't work out, I'm glad I didn't. I think that it's much more realistic to say, no, I'm not going to try to convert this bike, if I'm going to choose that, before the spring tour. So at the very least, I'm getting one more big tour, one more big ride out of the Safari. And I think that what that does, the fact that I'm giving myself a little more space to make this consideration, is that it gives me time to back out and consider any of the other viable options, including purchasing a new bike and having that be done, hitting the easy button and just getting a particular commercially available bike. Maybe something will pop out that really speaks to me. But I've also considered another one that actually, just sitting here talking this through, remember my guy Tim over in Portland, there's no reason why I couldn't ship out this bike and have Tim work off of this bike, the Safari. Now, that obviously can't happen until after this next tour, but it certainly would be a possibility. And of course, I could even fly out there with it on a trip out west. So, there's a lot of different things that are still on the table when it comes to this e-bike build. But I will say that from where I was at the start of the year to now, I feel like that I've learned a lot more. I feel like that I've continued to be as excited. Actually, I think I'm a little bit more excited about the prospects of this now. And I don't think I'm any closer to making a final decision on exactly how it's going to manifest itself. But I do feel like that the odds of it happening are much higher now. So anyways, that is basically your update on the pedal shift e-bike build /purchase/ whatever it's going to be. And I hope this is at least somewhat interesting and informative for you as I walk through this process. I think that there's so much information out there that it can be really, really overwhelming. There's sort of a paradox of choice as well. And if you're considering doing something with e-bikes and you've never have before, hopefully this is at least narrowing things down for you, or at least helping you come to a decision on what you are going to do, including not ever doing it at all, which for many of you is probably also something that you would choose. I know that e-bikes are going to be something that I would enjoy, but it's not going to be the exclusive thing. I will always have an acoustic bike, even if it's just the Brompton, even if it's just the Green Goblin, which is kind of more of a trainer right now. I do think that acoustic bikes are always going to be with me. So again, hopefully this has been helpful for you. We will definitely be revisiting this, especially as decisions get made later on in the year.
And as always, we like to close out the show with a special shout out to the Pedal Shift Society. Because of support from listeners like you, Pedal Shift is a weekly bicycle touring podcast with a global community, expanding into live shows and covering new tours. If you like what you hear, you can support the show for $5, $2, or even $1 a month. And there's one shot and annual options if you're not into the small monthly thing. Check it all out at pedalshift.net/society. On to the society. Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lean, Andrew McGregor, Michael Hart, Keith Nagel, Brock Didis, Thomas Skadow, Marco Lowe, Terrence Manson, Harry Telgadas, Chris Barron, Mark Van Ram, Brad Hipwell, Mr. T, Nathan Poulton, Stephen Dickerson, Vince LaGreco, Cody Florchinger, Tom Beninati, Greg Braithwaite, Sandy Pizzio, Jeff Muster, Seth Pollock, Joseph Quinn, Drew Porter, Byron Patterson, Joaquin Robber, Ray Jackson, Jeff Fry, Kenny Mikey, Lisa Hart, John Denkler, Steve Henkel, Miguel Quinones, Alejandro Aviles Reyes, Keith Spangler, Greg Towner, Jody Zeranin, Lucas Barwick, Michael Baker, Brian Bechtal, Reinhard Bigel, Greg Middlemiss, Connie Moore, William Gothman, Brian Benton, Joan Churchill, Mike Bender, Rick Weinberg, Billy Crafton, Gary Matushak, Greg Latoile Lopez, James Sloan, Jonathan Dillard, John Funk, Ronald Paroli, Dave Roll, Brian Hafner, Misha LeBlanc, Ari Messenger, David Kropke, Todd Grossbeck, Wally Estrella, Sue Reinert, John Lico, Stephen Granada, Philip Mueller, Robert Lackey, Dominic Carroll, Jackie McCullum, John Hickman, Carl Presseau, David Neves, Patty Louise, Terry Fitzgerald, Peter Steinmetz, Timothy Fitzpatrick, Michael Azuski, Hank O'Donnell, David Zanoni, David Weil, Matthew Sponseller, Chad Reno, Spartan Dale, Carolyn Ferguson, Peggy Littlefield, Lauren Allensmith, Eric Burns, Thomas Pearl, Darren McKibben, Richard Stewart, Dave Fletcher, Jack Smith, Luke Parkinson, Ryan Patterson, Sarus Faravar, John Gardner, Sam Scruggs, Dwight Pintinger, Connie Bowder, Rob Merrifield, and thanks to all past and anonymous folks for helping make this show happen.
Thank you for joining. You can find Pedal Shift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedal Shift project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.